So let us begin. First, I'd like to acknowledge the partners that made this webinar possible. Of course, we got support from the province of British Columbia, Canada, and the Canadian Agricultural Partnership. And we've extracted materials from all sorts of different sources to make this webinar. And while BC is committed to maintaining and improving dam safety, the opinions in this webinar are those of the presenter and may not necessarily be those of the governments of Canada or BC. So what are we going to cover today? Really two main topics, the BC Dam Safety Regulation. And within that topic, we're going to look at how the dam and reservoir dimensions interact with the regulation. And we're looking at the dam failure consequence classification. And linked into that, there'll be a little bit of discussion of the frequency of dam safety activities that are linked to the consequence classification. And we're going to spend probably 2/3 of the webinar focusing on how to determine the consequence classification for your dam. Factors to consider. We'll go through some examples, and in this webinar, we're going to try even some live interactive determination of consequences, and a little bit of the importance of flood mapping, which is often links into the consequences, and your dam emergency plan. So that's our topics for today. So the BC Dam Safety Regulation. So it sets in a document the best practices aspects for the design, construction, operation, maintenance of your dam. It also includes things like removal and decommissioning of the dam. It's been around for a number of years now, since 2016. And it's a document that you can find easily online if you wanted to read the actual regulation. And whether your dam falls within the regulation or not, and how it's regulated is somewhat a function of two things: the dimensions of the dam, and that's including the reservoir itself, and the dam failure consequences. So we're going to focus on these two issues today: the dam dimensions and how it determines whether certain parts of the regulation apply to your dam. And then we're going to also talk about the dam failure consequences. There's a classification scheme that you need to understand. You have to, as a dam owner, reclassify or review your classification every year and do so appropriately. So we'll work on dimensions first, and then I'll pass the mic over to Aaron to start talking about consequences. So in terms of dimensions, what's important are the dam height and the impounded volume of water in the reservoir, particularly the live volume of water. And so here's a little schematic illustration of a cross-section through a dam. And it's illustrating where the height of the dam is measured, typically from the crest of your dam. And if your dam doesn't have a horizontal crest, it might be the lowest point on the crest of your dam, down to the toe of the dam, often where the pre-existing stream bed was located. So that's your dam height. It's a vertical distance. And you're looking at the downstream toe, not the upstream toe, which will give you a smaller vertical height, but the definition is it's based on the downstream toe of your dam. And then the impounded volume of water in the reservoir behind that structure, depending on your configuration, you may have a little bit of dead storage, water that would not drain out if, for example, the dam did not exist. That might have been a pre-existing pond or lake. So it's the impounded volume of water that's sometimes called live volume that's important for the regulation. And it's these conditions in terms of their importance are embedded right in the regulation. So you can see that the height of the dam is the vertical distance to the top of a dam. And this describes a little bit about where to measure it from, which is really matching that cross section that I had just showed you. So these things are built right into the regulation. And here's another example. So in this particular case, the impounded water is all live storage. There's no dead storage, because if that dam were to breach or fail, all of that water would likely leave the structure and head downstream. And then the height of a dam is again illustrated from the highest, basically from the dam crest down to the very toe of the dam, where the embankment meets the original stream bed.
Dwayne, on that slide too, there's a note about the low-level outlet. So oftentimes the low-level outlet, at least on the upstream end, is at the lowest point, but sometimes that's not the case. So you can see if you had a low-level outlet that's higher up, you would still have all the live storage upstream of the embankment structure would still be live storage, just regardless of where the low-level outlet is set. So.
Yeah, and because effectively, if you had a worst case scenario and the whole dam were to breach and it erodes right down to the original stream bed, and that's what we're using to really define the height of the dam. And then the regulation goes on to say that depending on certain other aspects, putting some values to these heights and volumes, certain parts of the regulation will apply or they may not apply. So there's a bunch of text here, which I'm not going to read because we'll show it to you more schematically. And so you need to be aware of these where these numbers, how they plot out. And this is probably the best way to visualize what that text in the regulation was saying. So we look at this little graph, and it's got two axes. The vertical axis is the dam height, and the horizontal axis is the impounded volume. This is the live storage volume. And there are some thresholds plotted on this graph. You're going from looking at the horizontal axis, 10,000 cubic meters, 30,000 cubic meters and above. And then on the vertical axis, we got this 2.5 and 7.5. And so there's the regulation, your dam will be regulated if it's sitting in that light yellow region. And the dam safety regulation may not apply if you're sitting in the green area. And so that would be for a relatively small reservoir and a relatively small dam. And they are defined as minor dams and are exempt from the regulation, although they still may still require a water license. And so that green area, just as a visual on that, I mean, if you happen to have a small 1 hectare reservoir, 100 meters by 100 meters, with an average depth of 1 meter, you would just be lying on the threshold between green and yellow. So it may not, it may be exempt from the regulation. I would imagine most people attending today have dams that are larger than that. And then the regulation talks about this in a bit more detail in terms of the heights and volumes. And then it links in this notion that the classification of the dam is also important because it dictates whether or not this part 3 of the regulation will apply to your dam. And I'm not going to read this text. I mean, it is important, but we'll look at some examples. So here's that same plot that we saw before, but with a little bit more detail on it. So we see we have a dark yellow region, and if your dam height and impounded volume falls within that region, the entire regulation will apply to your dam, regardless of the dam consequence. If, however, your dam is a little bit smaller or your reservoir is a bit smaller, but it's big enough to be outside of the green region, you're in that light yellow area, and the regulation applies, but part 3 of that regulation may not apply to your dam. And the situation where it doesn't apply to your dam is if it's a low consequence dam. So you need to know the consequence classification to decide whether or not part 3 of that regulation is going to apply to your dam. And of course, in this webinar today, we are going to focus a little bit on how to determine that consequence classification for your dam. So this little figure is really embodies a whole lot of the words in that dam safety regulation. So let's look at some examples. Okay, at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a little cross section of a pond. It's dug out of the ground, and does the regulation apply to the structure? Does part 3 of the regulation apply to the structure? So this particular structure has a volume of 36,000 cubic meters, and you might think that you're sitting in that light yellow area. However, that water is all dead storage. There is no dam. There's no berm wrapping around a dugout. This is really a dugout. And so while it has a significant volume of water stored there, in terms of the regulation, the impounded or live storage is 0 cubic meters, and that dam height is 0, and it's not a dam. Regulation doesn't apply. And so a lot of ranchers and farmers will have dugouts, and those dugouts are not dams, and regulation doesn't apply. If, however, you have a dugout and you put a berm around it so that you have a dugout dam combination, what's the situation for this example? Well, the live storage is 8,000 cubic meters for this hypothetical example. And 8,000 cubic meters is below that 10,000 cubic meter threshold on the plot. So you're landing in the green area. And the dam height itself is 2.4. So the red dot on the plot is showing where this structure falls. So this is classified as a minor dam. And as long as the consequence of its failure being low, the regulation is not going to apply. There are exceptions. If there were some critical consequence for even a small structure failing, the dam safety officer could ask that structure to become a regulated dam. But that would be pretty rare.
Dwayne, I've got a question that applies to this one. Measuring the live storage, we don't really have a defined point at the top of the live storage. The question was, is that measured from, say, like a spillway culvert or the sill of a spillway? And I mentioned that it's typically from the spillway invert. But there is some BC guidance out there that says culverts should be used as spillways. So because they typically get blocked and other things, and you should have.
Should not be used as spillways.
What's that?
They should not be used as spillways. Culverts.
They should not be used. Okay, sorry if I said it wrong. So if you just have a small culvert in there that's probably not sized appropriately, your live storage could be right to the crest of your dam. Generally, if you have a properly sized spillway, you measure the live storage to the invert of the spillway. So there are special cases, of course, if you have flood attenuation structures that are for the purpose of flood mitigation, you may actually have some level of surcharge that is normal, right? So a surcharged elevation above your spillway may be a normal live storage for you. In that case, it may be different. But anyway, just wanted to differentiate that. That's where you measure to, is typically the spillway sill to where you're sort of at the invert of your berm or dam is your live storage.
And even on this schematic drawing, you see the live storage does not go up to the very top of the dam or berm, because there would be some sort of overflow or spillway structure. And there's a freeboard that's not included as live storage under normal operating conditions. Okay, so all I've done now is I've simply changed the dimensions a little bit. So now the live storage is 15,000 cubic meters. Everything else is more or less the same. And of course, we move across from green to light yellow. and the regulation now applies to this particular dam. But if the consequence of the failure of that structure is low, the dam itself would be exempt from Part 3 of the regulation. But only if the consequence is low. If the consequence is anything other than low, the dam, the entire regulation would apply to that particular structure. And then this may be our more typical situation. So we have an embankment, a low-level outlet. There's our live storage. And I've labeled that as a full supply water level. That's when that reservoir is completely full right up to perhaps your sill of your spillway. And it's storing 35,000 cubic meters of water. That's a 3-meter dam. What part of the regulation applies? Well, we're now plotting in the dark yellow region. So the entire regulation applies. But we don't know what the consequence of that particular structure is. And that's something that's determined independently of the dimensions of the dam and the volume of the live storage. But we do know that the entire regulation will apply, and regardless of the consequence of failure for that particular structure. So that's essentially how you would use the sizes of your dam, basically the height of the dam. It's the only size that really matters in the regulation here, and the volume of the water stored behind that structure to determine whether the regulation applies and what parts of the regulation would apply to your dam. And so now we need to focus on how do we determine that consequence, because that's important as well, perhaps more important than figuring out where we land in this on this plot. So Aaron, I'll let you take over consequences.
Okay, so we have just a couple more slides here where we're digging into the regulation, and then we're going to be diving into examples. So like Dwayne said, dimensions, right? Volume and dam height, real simple, and it's live volume. So consequences trump everything, right? So doesn't matter what your volume is or where you end up on that chart. Ultimately, if your consequence, if there ends up being potential consequences of your dam failing, then your classification is going to bump up. The only way that those, that you can be, only part of that consequence is if you are low consequence and you are dimensionally a small dam. So here's a slide right from the dam safety regulation regarding consequences. And the main thing I want to point out here on this slide is the bottom definition: consequences of failure. The dam safety regulation definition means losses or damages that are caused by a dam failure. So that's why we often think about live storage, because it's the amount of water that's impounded by the dam that gets released. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, because that can change. In a flood condition, your dam could hold more water than even your live storage. So we're going to go into this in a little bit more detail. Okay, I'm just stealing it from you, Dwayne. Hopefully I have control.
Did you get it?
No, I might just have to ask you for next slide. Oh, there we go. Okay, dam safety regulation, consequences. So I'm just going to pull out a couple things from the dam safety regulation. Again, there's the consequence of failure definition, but failure is also defined. So in relation to a dam means an uncontrolled release of all or part of the water impounded by the dam, whether or not caused by a collapse. So this could be a gate failure. This could be anything that the dam causes, right? So it could be, typically it's a release of water, but it may not necessarily be a full catastrophic release of the dam. So here's some other points. So we need to be considering the consequences upstream and downstream of the dam, right? If our dam were to fail catastrophically, maybe there's no consequences downstream, but a rapid reduction of reservoir volume, if you have a large reservoir, You could cause instability around the banks of the reservoir. You could cause, landslides or even damage to residential structures. So we need to think about that. And the term consequences refers to the damage exceeded that which would have occurred in the same event or conditions had the dam not failed. This may also be called incremental consequences. So we're going to talk about this a little more in the next slides. But for example, in a flood condition, if the dam didn't fail, you may still have a lot of consequences, but those are not consequences from your dam failing. So these are not consequences we consider here. So we're just going to move forward. Was I able to move that, Dwayne? Okay, yep. Great. I got control. Okay, so consequences, again, we're going to go into the different categories of what they are and how we evaluate them, but we basically put them in these 5 categories. And so these new classifications are the same classifications that are with the Canadian Dam Association and now with our current dam safety regulation. And these have been in force, I think, since even 2011. And certainly since the 2016 updates. And don't quote me on that, but these are the classifications that we have: low, significant, high, very high, and extreme. So here are the classifications. So generally, when we look at consequences, what we want to do is we want to think about not only upstream and downstream consequences, but we want to look at each category. And there's a lot of, it gets pretty complicated, and we really want to be thorough about looking at each one of these categories. But typically loss of life, we look at that first. Second, well, really the order doesn't matter, but each one of these categories we look into. So loss of life, environmental and cultural losses, economic losses. So loss of life is simple. If it can potentially cause, and we're talking about human life here. Other like habitat loss or impact to wildlife. Cultural losses can be anything from heritage sites to sacred sites. They can be anything of cultural value. They could be, I suppose, even certain environmental, rare, features could even have cultural losses. So that's what we're talking about in environmental and cultural losses category. And then economic, of course, roads, impacts to the economy, the impacts to houses, infrastructure, anything that has a dollar value. I see quite a few comments here that I'm certainly going to be chiming into, and just not while I'm going through my slides. So apologies. Dwayne, if you're able to, you may be able to respond.
Well, I think what we'll do is we'll have a pause later and address some of the questions, because there's some good questions coming in.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we will get back to those questions. So one thing too I want to highlight here is the most severe potential consequences in any category will dictate the dam consequence classification. So if you have no other potential consequences except for environmental, maybe there's a rare species that lives or is in a rare habitat below your dam, then, and that's very high or even extreme, it's going to bump up. And same with any of the other consequence classifications here. So, Dwayne, can I get the next slide there? Okay, so here's the table that right in the regulation, there's this table, and this table gives us a brief description of what those consequences are. So when we're looking at any one of the categories, loss of life, and we looked at all the different dimensions, you can only be low if, for example, loss of life, it's an easy one to go over. No possibility of loss of life other than unforeseeable misadventure. So really you need to be in a rural place with no structures, very little of anything there that would attract human traffic or anything like that. And so you can see, and I'll just go over the loss of life category here. Significant, a low potential for multiple loss of life. Generally, you don't have any permanent structures down below. So if we look at the second column, population at risk, we have none, then temporary only. So that maybe it's an RV site or something like that. And pretty much if you have any permanent structures or potential loss of life, if your dam were to fail, you're almost automatically in the high category. So we're going to be looking at this a little more in the following slides. Next slide, Dwayne. And so here's just the rest of that table. And we can see the loss of life goes up significantly from high to very high. We go from 10 to 100. There's other things as well, certainly in the environmental and cultural and the infrastructure and economics. And then extreme, we're talking about more than 100 people potentially dying in a failure of a dam. And so we're going to go over these different categories in more detail in our examples. So Dwayne, can we get next slide? So for the dam safety regulation to work, it's very important that all dams in BC have the appropriate consequence classification registered with their dam. So this whole workshop here today is to make sure we get that right. So the intent of the regulation is to ensure that risk mitigation activities are commensurate or fitting or appropriate with the worst case consequences of failure. And that's because as the consequence goes up, so does your responsibilities as a dam owner. And we're going to go over some of those in a minute. But for example, if you have a significant consequence dam, automatically Part 3 applies. You should have dam emergency plan in place. You should have an operation, maintenance, and surveillance document in place. And the frequencies of inspection and so on, surveillance, they all go up as the consequence of your dam goes up. So we want to be proportional. We want everything we do to be proportional to the risk that you have. And it's really in your best interest. And I really believe the dam safety regulation is a minimum requirement. It's kind of the standard bar that we should all be meeting. And it's to secure your asset and to manage your risk. So next slide, Dwayne.
Aaron, I was wondering, because we're going to be focusing on consequence for most of the rest of the slides, whether we could take a pause just to look at two questions. So there was a question about a dam that was only 97 centimeters high with a huge volume, 61 million cubic meters of water storage. And the dam has been assessed as significant. And the comment was, your chart shows 97 centimeters as below the threshold. Well, come on, we're only below by 3 centimeters here, and that's a huge volume of water. I can see how the DSO would still want to include that in the regulation.
That's right, and
so I commented on that. Your dam may fall in that green area, but it could still be deemed kind of important to be as a regulated structure. And that's probably one of those examples.
Right.
And the other question was for a run-of-river facility. The normal water level, because it's run-of-river, is probably going over the spillway all the time, so that the kind of live storage level would be the invert of the spillway plus the typical amount that's running over it. And I think I would probably interpret the regulations as being including the spillway invert and the normal height of water going over it, and not a flood event over a run-of-river. But that's an example that I haven't had personal experience with, and we do have DSOs on this webinar, and they can chime in about how they would prefer to define the volume stored behind a run-of-river dam.
Yeah, that's one thing we didn't have, is a definition of live storage, right?
Well, just where do you take the top from, right? When it's constantly going over a spillway, for example, under normal operations.
That's right. Yeah, and it's typically the normally impounded volume. So it really depends on the case. Typically the spillway invert, but again, like we mentioned earlier, if you always have a couple feet of water going over, then well, your live storage is more than that. So then a special case would apply, I would think.
You know, like Brian's comment about, okay, the dam was bumped up to significant because, you know, 60 million cubic meters of water is a lot. And
Yes.
even if you lost a 1 meter high dam, there could be a significant consequence to that.
Yeah, and no pun intended, right? It could be
Yeah, no pun intended.
consequences. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so hopefully that answers those questions.
Okay, then sure, let's continue.
Yeah, no, that was a good point to stop before we dive into here. And so, who performs the consequence classification? Well, oftentimes, you know, you get this dam, you inherit it, you know, you get a new role, and it already has one, right? Typically, there's one already on file. It may have been done by a consultant, determined by a consultant or a dam safety officer. But generally on new dams, will be done by a consultant on behalf of the owner. But in many cases, we know it's already on file, and it may have been done by the owner, it may have been done by the dam safety officer. So typically when you do an initial determination, oftentimes you're going to spend a lot more time. You're going to look at it, you're going to be thorough, and we're going to get into some examples in a minute here. But then these are submitted to a dam safety officer for acceptance. So typically a dam break or inundation study is required. So they'll your consultant will look at your dam, they'll come up with what is a maximum potential release, and we're always thinking about worst case scenarios to think about the maximum risk that might be associated with this structure. So we're going to get in a little more detail on that in a minute, but owners can do these as well and submit them to a dam safety officer. Typically, that's not the case. So annual redeterminations are really the exact same thing. So we don't really want to differentiate the two, but once you have a consequence classification on file, what we do want to make you aware of is that the regulation requires that we look at it annually. So these are done by dam owners typically. And so, but they can also be completed by a consultant. So if you have a consultant doing your annual inspection, so your formal inspection, sometimes they're not annual, they may review your consequence for you and document that in your inspection. And if you're ever getting a dam safety review, so all dams with a high consequence or higher have to do these on a reoccurring time interval, they have to do a consequence classification review. So they would do that in a thorough manner. They would look at what you have on file, or they would typically conduct something on their own. So the differentiation is an annual redetermination is something that's now required, and a record should be kept on file. So it could just be a note, but the key is we need clear rationale and justification, and that should be documented. So typically there's no change, so the rationale can be very simple. Write a date, looked at it, no change. So a dam safety officer can request for this annual check at any time. So, you know, however long you've had the dam, well, I should say at least since 2016, the requirement to do an annual check, you should have records on file. And if you don't, then even just starting today is important. So, and another note here is a dam safety officer may order the consequence classification to be reviewed by a qualified professional. So that's typically if your consequence classification may have become out of date or what you have is not appropriate. So that example about the 97 centimeter high weir dam with that like millions and millions of cubic meters behind it, that may be into question, and your dam safety officer can order that you have that reviewed. And so we're going to look at some examples here in just a minute. Dwayne, could you get the next slide? So here's an example of a dam break study or inundation study. There's a couple of different names you could use. So this slide shows an example of maximum water depth. Typically, we look at maximum water depth, we look at velocity, bulking, all kinds of other things. But oftentimes, you'll only do this once at the beginning, especially if you don't change the height of your dam. You don't really change your dam. Downstream, maybe some new development might happen, so we review that. So this is typically supported by, we mentioned before, a breach calculation or a dam breach, flow estimate. So your initial determination, if it has mapping like this, it's a really great way to support the determination. And it doesn't have to be this complex. We'll see that in a minute. And then again, a clear rationale or justification for the consequence. So mapping can be simple or complex. What do we have? We got a note here. So yeah, and this mapping, you can see how useful this mapping is to support dam emergency planning. Again, if you have a high consequence or a higher dam, you need to have a dam emergency plan. I recommend all dams have some sort of a plan. And a map like this, even if it's simple and just a highlighted area, will greatly support your dam emergency plan and certainly your annual redeterminations. So Dwayne, next slide. And we've got a question here as well. Dwayne, if you could read that. So failure types. I mentioned this a little bit. So we should be looking and considering flood-induced failures as well as sunny day failures. So really the differentiation is flood-induced failures are failures resulting from a natural flood of a magnitude that is greater than what the dam can safely pass. And I would go further and say flood-induced failures could be ones that it can safely pass, but oftentimes we might have still a failure that was induced by a flood. It could be debris coming down and blocking your spillway. Typically, they're overtopping failures, but they don't always have to be. So flood-induced failures almost always have more water in the dam than sunny day failures. That is one kind of general rule. You could have an elevated water elevation and then have an internal erosion failure or a stability or a slide of your dam. And then you lose freeboard and then it overtops. So we're talking about lots of different types of flood-induced scenarios when we're talking about flood-induced failures. Sunny day failures are like today. Sunny or not, it's not that sunny today, but it's a typical day where it just fails. So typically you have a full pool or you definitely don't have an elevated pool. And we're thinking about internal erosion or things like that. But one thing that is different is we typically don't have any warning. So that's one differentiation between the two. And there's lots of guidance on these, and we're not going to jump into those, but we're going to do a quick technical background of some CDA guidance and some BC guidance that we do have on file.
Yeah, because the dam owner is not expecting their dam to fail on a normal day. As opposed to during a flood, you're probably worried about your dam and watching it more carefully, right? But on a sunny day or a day where there's no flood happening in your watershed, you may not be expecting anything. And that's right. Where you get limited or no warning.
Exactly. So, and we'll get into fatality rates in just a bit, but fatality rates, when we're trying to determine, at least with more complex methods, how many people could potentially die, we use different fatality rates. So there's a higher likelihood if the failure occurs without warning, for example. So, and again, the scope of this workshop isn't to get into the details of technical analysis, but to give an overview for owners. So Dwayne, next slide. Okay, perfect. So here's an example of flood-induced failures, and we'll do a non-one in a second, non-flood-induced. So remember, consequences refer to damage above and beyond the damage that would have occurred in the same event or conditions had the dam not failed. So here's an example, and it's actually from that previous mapping slide. If you were to zoom in on one area, you would see the flooding on the right. So the flooding on the right was the worst case scenario in that particular dam, for that particular dam. So it ended up being the maps used for dam emergency planning and determination of consequence. But we need to think about what is the incremental consequences when we think about flood-induced failures. Because if in this case, it was a high consequence dam, we had a 1 in 1,000 year flood as a high, yeah. So we had actually 1/3 between. So it was bigger than a 1 in 1,000 year flood event. And so when that occurred, you can see on the left image there, it jumped the banks. We had lots of flooding. It even impacted homes. But on the right, you can see with a dam failure, it's significantly greater flooding. So if you were to have, depending on where your houses are located, or just depending on what the consequences are on the left to the right, it's the difference between the two, right? So if the flood occurring would have already caused certain losses, those wouldn't apply to the flood-induced failure. You kind of subtract them off, right? So we want to think about what are the consequences because of the dam failure. So in a sunny day failure, Dwayne, if you could show us the next slide there. So here's a sunny day failure. We have, obviously a city, and we don't have any flood occurring in this case. And without warning, we have a failure of the dam. So in this case, all incremental consequences are total consequences, because generally speaking, that's the case for sunny day failures, because all the consequences were caused by the failure of the dam. So in more complex scenarios or dam break analysis, the consequence determination is a little bit different, and we look at multiple scenarios. And so you can see here, there's quite a bit of impact. So some other factors to consider: inflow diversions are typically left open, say in a flood induced. Think about the springtime in freshet. That's typically when you're going to have these major events with snow melt, but it's also the same time we're trying to capture water for our irrigation. So we have those valves open. Sometimes we can't get to them quick. So we need to think about what's conceivable to be a worst case scenario. So diversions left open, release valves left closed, because we're typically not irrigating yet when it's still melt and it's still rain season. Logs and debris jams. If you get a 1 in 100, 1 in 200, 1 in 500 year event, all these things are going to happen. You're going to have log debris, you're going to have all kinds of stuff coming down. So we need to think about what, it may not be normal or typical, but in an event like that, it's going to be very expected. So cascading failures, are there going to be road culverts and things that get plugged upstream, water gets impounded, and then they fail? So we need to think about that if our dams are of a higher consequence than the road, because these types of inflows are going to start happening with flood-induced failures for your dam. If your dam fails also, what else are we going to cause that could cascadingly fail downstream? And so again, that's another thing, mud and debris flows. Now we got saturated banks, we've got these massive releases of water. We're going to cause accumulation of debris and other things. So all this stuff is stuff we should think about when we think about consequences, because typically the consequences always compound when we think about these extreme events. So Dwayne, next slide there.
So I'm gonna walk through this little example, and I'm going to try to use the example to actually answer one of the questions that has come in. And so this is a map showing two dams. The red objects are the dams on a small reservoir. And our goal is to determine the classification, the consequence classification, if these dams were to fail. And so what we have plotted here is just a simple sketch of, and highlighted in yellow, where would the flood waters go? And so if the northernmost dam were to fail, they would flow down into this larger lake, but it's not huge. It's larger than the reservoir, and possibly we could get some localized flooding along the shoreline of that lake. And so for the northern dam, what might be the potential losses? Well, there's a forest service road that is potentially impacted. And if there were homes, around this lake, would there be flooding or not? You'd have to look at the volume of this reservoir compared to the sort of the area of this lake to estimate what the maximum height of water rise could be. And then from that, you can make an assessment of what potential losses could occur. And if I look at the southern dam, if it were to fail, it would come down this creek and enter a much larger lake. And this lake is so much larger that the flood waters would essentially be fully absorbed, and the lake level would, for all practical purposes, not even change. But the water going down the creek could have an impact, again, on this Forest Service road. Now, had there been knowledge, pre-existing knowledge that there were some, archaeological sites or culturally significant sites along that creek, then that might drive your classification a little bit higher. That's one of the things that you need to consider. And the question was, who's responsible for understanding what archaeological sites might exist? And I think the pragmatic answer is be aware of what is registered. I don't know that a dam owner for these smaller rural dams has the resources to be conducting archaeological surveys, but you can certainly look at pre-existing and registered sites that might be along a watershed. And then depending on how close they might be to the creek, make an assessment of what type of losses could occur if that dam were to fail. So you could do a fairly simple assessment, but you want to be conservative in the assumptions about what losses could occur, because that provides a relatively sound rationale for your classification. It's simple, but be conservative. And then you look at the various possible losses. And so for this particular example, no one lives, there's no permanent buildings, homes along here are cabins. So there's, low potential for multiple losses of life. As far as those environmental cultural values, maybe your knowledge is that there is no archaeological features. I mean, there's going to be some damage to the watershed, but the environment is likely to perhaps be able to recover or not. You have to make that judgment. How about those Forest Service roads? How important are those Forest Service roads? Because they could be impacted or washed out if your dam were to fail. And then, of course, you lose some assets at the dam itself. You might lose the reservoir, and that water might be important. And then your dam assets might be important. And so there are some rules of thumb which we'll talk about, but we're sitting, for this example, we're sitting, we're thinking we probably have no loss of life in terms of humans, but in these other categories, we're kind of spanning across from significant to high. So is it no significant loss, or is it a significant loss of habitat or endangered species? Is it low economic losses or high economic losses? And so you have to make that assessment. And in order to help do that, there are some guidelines. For example, this one here, downstream consequence failure classification interpretation guideline. And as the regulations are very brief, and to better understand the significance of the words in these tables, it's a wise thing to look at these type of documents, because they help you interpret the consequence descriptions, and it helps you decide, are you in significant or are you in high? And within those guidelines, there is some specific notes, rules of thumb that are helpful. So with respect to Forest Service roads, if that Forest Service road serves as access to private property, recreational areas, or industrial use, and it could be washed out, well, it's going to be insignificant. In the case history we just saw, we see the Forest Service road is providing access to the reservoir and another lake, likely to be recreational areas. And so washing that thing out would be automatically kind of pegged as a significant classification. If that Forest Service road serves as sole access to community, you're automatically going to be higher up on that classification. And the same thing, we have similar things if it's Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure road. Other rules of thumb, if the reservoir was a sole source of water, say for drinking or irrigation purposes, and you lost the reservoir because the dam fails, then you should be sitting at high or even higher than high as a classification. And we didn't have this in this particular example, but had there been a main railway located below those dams, these railways are critical pieces of infrastructure, economic infrastructure for Canada, and the consequence jumps up to be typically very high in that kind of situation. So, you can do a conservative approach. You can use the guidance to come up with what you think are the losses in each of the categories, and whatever the highest consequence or the highest losses, that dictates the classification. And then sometimes you are struggling to know whether are you sitting at high or are you just a significant classification. And that might then trigger the need to do a more detailed approach to classifying the dam. And I think Aaron, you're going to now walk through an example like that.
Yeah, thanks, Dwayne. So this is an example of we're calling it the hillside dam. So it's kind of on a moderate slope. It's a little bit steeper at just immediately to the left of the dam, and then it kind of flattens out. So we have some houses below. You can kind of see them at that scale there. And so the scale on the bottom is 0.3 kilometers or 300 meters for the length of that scale, to give you some idea. So we've got 125,000 cubic meters in that. It's kind of like a dugout with a larger berm on one side, and we see it's 5.5 meter high berm, and 105,000 cubic meters of that volume is live storage. So we have no consequence on file. It was constructed in 1990. So next slide, Dwayne. So just like we reviewed earlier that Dwayne showed us, we start with dimensions. So we quickly plot that on our graph, and we see that the entire regulation applies. So what is the consequence? So it's probably not low. We've got houses below, so let's see. So Dwayne, next slide. So we would like to always start with the simplest approach. So it costs less money. You can do this yourself. You can just use the contours, right? And highlight all the areas. You can use Google Earth or something of that nature. So based on a conservative, simple assessment of the inundation, permanent residents are downstream. So we don't know really what the flow here is like. So we're already thinking likely a high consequence, right? We've got permanent residents and potential loss of life. Other consequences are likely significant to high. So we've got road types. None of them are the primary or only access. We don't see any major highways. These are arterial roads and small driveways and things like that. So based on the rules of thumb that Dwayne just introduced to us, using those guidance documents and the definitions of the table, we could probably assess this with just this information here and submit that and get a DSO approval for high, right? Because it's reasonable, it's conservative, we can provide rationale for that, we can reference those documents. Can further assessment reduce the consequence classification though? So, and again, this kind of depends, right? We may want to look at it further. So in this case, more analysis was done. So we've done a breach estimate using various guidance out there, come up with a flow rate. We looked at every single possible location on that berm, from the top side to the bottom side, because sometimes location of failure, even if it's not your critical or highest section, can be much worse. So we're thinking about debris flows, we're thinking about all those different things that we talked about, upstream, downstream, loss of the structure.
And this is what it looks like. So here's our depth map. We're seeing depths, upwards of 2 meters there, greater than 2 meters in some of the low-lying areas. For the most part, we're about a foot to 3 feet. So, up to about a meter in most areas that are orange to red. So Dwayne, next slide. And here's the velocity. So, and again, these are various different types of flood induced and sunny day, and these were the worst case. And we see some pretty fast velocities, certainly on the steep sections, just below and left of the dam. So if you can see the scale there between 200 and 400 meters from the dam, that we're probably going to get some debris run out into those areas below. Dwayne, can you see any houses in there that might be?
Yeah, I see something right here. There might be some homes located here.
Okay, so we've got some structures there. From the most part, everything else seems, and again, these are velocities here, right? So we're seeing velocities of maybe 5 meters per second. We're talking pretty fast. If you pop back to the last slide, Dwayne, so we're moving at a pretty good speed and maybe 2 feet deep, right? So we got some real erosion potential, probably risk to structures.
But this more detailed analysis is indicating very specific areas that would be inundated, as opposed to this one,
The areas,
which covers, is very conservative and covers a much broader area.
and we don't know what the worst case scenario is because we haven't modeled all the scenarios. So, So this gives us a lot more detail to be able to assess those consequences. So actually, as it turns out, those are outbuildings. So they're sheds and no permanent residents in that location. So we actually don't hit any homes, even with all the variation of possible outcomes here, even considering debris runout areas. So Dwayne, next slide. So using this depth and velocity, we don't want to get into too much detail, but we can get a sense of the power or the hazard of all these different scenarios. And once we look at them all, we can plot that for every area. You could even use GIS and plot all the homes or pull a layer on and then apply those values to those homes, assume number of people. And I don't want to get into too much detail, but very easily we could apply a fatality rate using guidance. So Dwayne, if we were, I'm trying to, maybe if you jump back a slide and we look at, say, even though that little area Dwayne pointed out wasn't homes, if they were, we're maybe,
we might at the upper end be close to 9 meters per second.
Okay, go up a slide for depth.
And depth, we're probably, I don't know, maybe getting close to a meter deep.
Yeah, to make it easy.
Yeah.
And then jump back down to fatality rate. So if we roughly call it 9, and you go up and you use the selected curve, we have a fatality rate of 0.01, right, in this case. And we could use a higher curve, and this depends again on things like what type of event is it? Is it one that might have warning? Typically, we'll assume no warning in these types of cases. And so you would have the number of people times your fatality rate. In this case, it's still very unlikely that you would have loss of life in that condition. We don't have.
Well, in this case, the population at risk, because they're farm, barns, or sheds, is probably very small, and then your fatality rate is still around 1%. So 1% of less than one person,
right,
might lose their life.
It would obviously be very different if you were right below the failure, and maybe not this map, but a different map might have shown that you could, and you're in a debris runout zone, you could have a fatality rate of 1, right? So Dwayne, next slide.
Well, just before we move on, so this methodology, when you use inundation mapping and you track the depth and velocity of the water, so we're using it for calculating or estimating loss of life, but it can also be used for other losses, economic losses and things like that too. Oops.
That's right. We only cover this one out of simplicity, but again, we can assess a railroad crossing and will it wash out? So more detail can give us that, and we'll have more examples. So here, based on that information, we can categorize all these different ones. We can support those selections using, rules of thumb and other things in those guidance documents. And we can, with rationale, support the conclusion that this dam is now significant. So in this case, more analysis did actually move it from high to significant. And as you can see, that's a line of quite a bit of obligation. Your requirements bump up quite a bit between significant and high. You're going to require reoccurring dam safety reviews, which it comes at quite a cost to the dam owner. Regardless, we still need to be thinking about, will this change? And in this particular case, this dam probably will become a high consequence dam at some point in time. So next slide, Dwayne.
Yeah, particularly if those outhouses turn into, I don't know, a permanent home.
Yeah, or a suite, right? Those are getting popular.
Yeah, we always have to be cognizant of changes occurring downstream of our
that's right.
Of our
so
dams.
Yeah, so based on this example, just what we said, there is some justification for doing an analysis, and there's many cases where the analysis may make sense, and in some cases it doesn't make sense, because the simple approach, for example, if you're already an extreme consequence dam and you already have mapping on file, simplified mapping that provides enough for your emergency, maybe you're still going to come up with a extreme. So this reduces your minimum required frequency of surveillance, and also, like I said, the dam safety reviews. So, and you can still deviate from those. Remember, these are, in my opinion, the minimum best practices you should be implementing as a dam owner.
Okay, so just to kind of wrap up a little bit of what we've kind of covered so far, and we're going to do some more of this, but the BC Dam Safety Regulation applies to dams based on the dam dimensions, the dam height, and the reservoir dimensions, the live storage volume, and we already had a discussion that just precisely what is live storage can be, is open to interpretation a little bit. And then, of course, part 3 of the dam safety regulations is going to apply to dams that are higher consequence than low. And so we need to know this dam failure consequence classification, which is what we've been dealing with here in the last few minutes. Really, it's the responsibility of the dam owner to determine that classification. And the dam owner is free to engage with consultants to help in that process. And if you happen to do a simple classification, make sure you're conservative about your assumptions. That way you can justify and you have a rationale for your classification, because you may have used a very simple approach, but you were conservative when you did use that approach. And of course, if you find that approach drives you up to maybe a high consequence classification, you may be interested in doing a more detailed analysis, because that could maybe push you back down to, for example, significant. And as an owner, you have to document that, and you have to do it review it every year. It's important. That's a requirement in the regulation that you review your consequence classification every year. So what we're going to attempt to do here is we're going to go live here in a moment, and we're going to go to this part of the province, and Aaron's going to do a consequence classification using the simple conservative approach.
Okay, so all right, so we're on Google. Most people have Chrome or some browser, so BC Dam Safety. Let's see what we get. We've got, so we're on the BC Dam Safety section website. What I'm looking for is the free IMAP BC mapping. So if I just scroll right down, they've got this, dam locations. So we'll jump on IMAP. So this is a free mapping system that any one of us can use, so long as we have a browser. And we are just going to add some layers real quick here. So let's just add contours. We'll just add them to a 1 in 20,000 scale. There's just a myriad of different things we can add, railroads, streams, all kinds of things. But here we are. We can go to Victoria and go to the interior, lots of different dams everywhere. And I'm just going to go to my layers. So we can see all the consequences right here. And we can, down here, we can change, from roads to imagery. We've got lots of different topography and things like that. So, if we want to scroll into any dam, we just go find our dam. Here we've got some imagery on. So I'm just going to pick these two, kind of two in this area for an example. So let's turn on some contours like we did on the other one. So let's do a quick assessment of this structure, right? We kind of cheated a little because it's already got something on file here low, but let's do a quick assessment. This can be a reassessment or an initial assessment. So we can sketch, and maybe I'll just make a quick polyline. So we've got, these are 20-meter contours, I believe, at this scale. So we can kind of get an idea of where the water might flow here if this structure were to fail. And actually something else to show you is, I noted this, right? If it were to fail anywhere else on here, it would just kind of fill this area. It's got to flow downhill. So I'm just going to highlight this, and we could even export this as our map. We can throw this into our dam emergency plan, regardless if we need it or not. But so this is my area. So we can see there's not a lot there.
Oh, how big is that reservoir? Would it fall into?
We've got a little, let's start with dimensions, right? Before consequences. So what do we got? We got 24,000, call it 25,000 square meters.
Yeah, 25,000 square meters. And if it was average of 1 meter deep, we're at 25,000 cubic meters.
Yeah. And
that's way bigger than the green area in that graph the plot we're showing before.
That's right.
Right. So it'll be very likely to be a regulated structure. So why it's probably got the green on it right now.
Right. It would be above that 10,000.
Yep.
A meter deep of water would still be a 2-meter high dam, right? So we're going to be in a regulated zone in that bright yellow, but we're not necessarily a Part 3 apply, right?
Yeah.
And that's only if it's a low consequence, like you said, Dwayne. So is it a low consequence, right? Here's our area of potential blowout, and we're not.
I don't see any cabins at this scale. What do I see? I see there's a power line, but it's to the north and won't be affected by a flood.
Right. This is kind of upstream. Well, and the other thing, if it flows into here, we've only got 25,000 cubic meters as well as square meters. And this is quite a bit larger. So
yeah, at least maybe 5 times bigger.
So let's say it's even 3 times bigger to be conservative. We're only going to get a foot of water, roughly 0.3 meters in here. And that over a spillway is probably not really going to cause much impact. So, that really, this is what it entails. A quick check. This could be an annual redetermination or review, or you could export this and provide rationale and support and even submit this as your initial determination. That may be sufficient. So Dwayne, how about this one down below?
Okay. Well, it's a bigger reservoir. And am I seeing maybe some Forest Service roads? I think I am, leading up towards the dam, and further downstream I see some structures.
I'm just kind of following these contours here.
Yeah, looks like we got a ranch, some buildings.
The stream going through. I could turn the stream layer on, but
there's a more significant road at the bottom there.
Yeah, so we're going to cross this road, probably hit this creek or river. Maybe we're something like this. I'll be coarse. I'll just finish there. right? Might be something like this. Actually, I can add the stream lines. So we've got some kind of a crossing here. It could be an open, a bridge even. If we zoom in.
Well, that looks like a highway, in fact. So that's a very significant road that we could possibly wash out.
So definitely a significant or a secondary highway of some kind. We've got some, other outbuildings. I don't know if these are all commercial, but we probably have a residential site right there. Right. So we've got quite a few things here. What Dwayne, in a secondary highway was automatically, if it's impacted, it's going to be a very high. So this dam here, based on the coloring, is significant on file. We may, at least at this level of mapping, if we take this highway out, I mean, we've seen what highways taken out do, and based on the guidance would be a very high. Right?
Yeah.
So you can see how this level of review is adequate for the one above, but maybe not adequate for the one below, unless very high it is a determination that we're happy with and we want to be done there.
Yeah, it's going to depend on what kind of stream crossing is located there. Can it handle the whole flood? Probably not, but you'd have to look into that. And of course, if you own the dam, you would know all that information, so you could better make that assessment because you'd be familiar with the local situation.
It looks like some sort of a culvert.
Probably a culvert.
Yeah, but that's to give you an example of how this happens. You start simple and then you move forward. So Dwayne, maybe we'll jump back to the presentation there.
Okay. Yeah, so that was how we, you do a quick assessment of this one, another one of this. And of course, you're really relying on these aerial images and all the other various layers that you can load in. And so take advantage of the IMAP BC tool if you were attempting to classify your dam.
And so that last example I just showed, that's the same crossing. So in this case, decided that more analysis is necessary, whether or not it changes the consequence, having that on file for a dam emergency plan, right? Because we're going at least from significant higher, we want to have some dam emergency plan mapping as well. Here's the mapping. I'm not going to show the velocities and everything, but we're seeing quite a bit of water going over the road. In this case, it was sustained and over a long period of time. We had velocities, and really we have a granular embankment on the downstream. The determination was it's just going to continue to erode that downstream. We would lose at least 1 or 2 lanes. So this one, unfortunately, did go to a very high consequence, but again, necessitates the rationale for increasing the minimum frequency of activities at that dam to ensure that it doesn't fail, so that we don't have those impacts, in this case, consequences to the category of infrastructure and economy. So,
Okay.
Yeah. So next slide, Dwayne.
So I got just a very brief a video to play, and really it's to highlight, this need to review your dam classification every year. Because things happen, unfortunately, downstream of people's dams. Development occurs, and suddenly there's a cabin or a house or something, or an important road is constructed below your dam, and so we have to be aware that the consequence can creep up over time, and that's one of the purposes of in the regulation that the dam owner is required to review the consequence every year. So you're typically looking at for changes in the conditions downstream of your dam. And this is simply just a graphic to kind of show how that happens. I mean, it's unfortunate, but it occurs, and unfortunately for the dam owner, your consequence can creep up over time. I get to the next slide here. So just remember, it's, the regulation is there to try to ensure that things are safe for everybody in the province, the environment, economics, and people. And an owner must exercise reasonable care to avoid the risk of significant harm. And we're looking at those categories of public safety, like loss of life, the environment, and land or economic losses. And so it's built into the regulation. And part of that is the owner has got to be properly inspecting, maintaining, and repairing their dam. But of course, they're also being required to watch for things changing downstream for consequence creep. And built into the regulation, there's well, restate it again. Every year, you do a reclassification or redetermine the classification of your dam. And if necessary, submit to the DSO your new classification. Your classification is likely to only go up. This is probably relatively rare that they'll go down. The only example where they might go down is that perhaps you use a very simple conservative approach, and then you've engaged maybe with a consultant to do a more detailed approach, and you've been able to justify a lower classification. And of course, there's under part 3, as soon as your dam is significant or higher in terms of the classification, there's a whole series of things you have to do. So this table is kind of highlighting some of those things, for how the minimum kind of expected frequency of doing these things for surveillance, inspection, and it continues testing and operation, collecting readings, reviewing your emergency contacts, and updating your dam emergency plan, etc. And we've got some of these elements covered in previous webinars that are available on the dam safety website. So, we just saw an example. Aaron did it live. Let's just say you, as a dam owner, you owned that low consequence dam, the upper dam that we've already seen, right? It's about 25,000 square meters of surface area, and maybe it's about 25,000 cubic meters of volume. We didn't look at the dam height, but it could be something in that order. And you've reviewed the consequence classification and redetermined it year after year as low. So you're doing a good job. You've kept records on file, which is great. You're doing a good job. But a home or a cabin was just built along the creek coming from your dam. Now you have to reclassify that dam with that new knowledge. And so this could be the situation that you're dealing with. Aaron, what would you do?
Sure. Well, yeah, I guess we start by looking at the map we just made, right? So, and like Dwayne said, you identified this thing, so we're comparing it. Yeah, it's right beside the creek. We really don't see how that house couldn't be impacted by catastrophic release of that. So, let's think about it. So we've got 3 residents, right? And that's again from the BC guidance document that Dwayne showed earlier. It says, assume 3 people in the new home. Dwayne, next slide there. And so using that fatality rate, we don't know how deep and what the fatality rate is. So let's assume 3 people, right? 3 people.
That's a worst case, conservative assumption, right?
It's conservative. We have very simple mapping. It's certainly not a low potential for multiple, maybe it is, but we just don't have the information necessary. And so really we should be doing this. That was our previous determination that we supported. And there we go. Loss of life, we are jumping up to 10 or fewer. And even the population at risk is permanent, right? But we have not demonstrated that they're not outside of that risk area, right? So we have to assume that for at least that box, that box is checked, there's permanent residence directly in that hazard area, and there's potentially a loss of life of 3. So the infrastructure and or economics, probably a loss of home and the loss of the structure, we put that as significant. but the takeaway is that it automatically goes up, and we should be writing this down. And because there's also a change now, we should be submitting this to our dam safety officer for acceptance, and an acceptance of that will obviously change the requirements that you're going to have to follow through with as a dam owner. So next slide, Dwayne.
So our last example, you're going to take us, Eric, Aaron.
Sure, and if you see anything you'd like to speak to, just jump right in. So Testa Linden, right? This happened. When was it, Dwayne? 2010?
2010, yeah.
2010. So jumping to the bottom bill at first, then original date of construction 1937. So I imagine that map looked very different then. Not a lot of stuff going on in this case in the Oliver area. We only have 35,000 cubes. So if we did do, oh, that's total. So we have 20 to 29,000 impounded. And so we're just kind of under that 30,000 limit, but we are regulated. We're going to be regulated with a dam height of 3.3 and at least pre-2010. So 1937, maybe it was a consequence classification of low. I mean, it's long before we had a dam safety regulation, but you can see how that we would have consequence creep here. So Dwayne, do you have any comments to those bullets? No?
Well, I mean, we talked about considering everything when you're doing your classification.
Right.
And the one critical thing about this specific dam is that the dam is over 1 kilometer higher than the valley bottom. And this is scale 1 kilometer. So we're about 8 kilometers away, but the water is going to descend vertically 1 kilometer. So this watershed or this creek is very steep. And that's got to trigger some warning to the dam owner, because if you let that volume of water go out, it's going to likely be more than just this bit of water coming down to the valley bottom. That was the critical finding from this case history.
You can see the scale there as well that I didn't point out. So that's
Yeah.
about 1 kilometer, and that 30,000, 35,000 total storage is almost entirely covered up by just the thickness of the little green.
Yeah, it's a little thing up here. It seems trivial, but
Gives
it's
you an idea of
very
scale.
high above the valley.
Right. Okay, so next slide. So that's really our height, and those are our dimensions that we cover first always. So exempt from part 3 of the regulation, but only if low consequence. Remember that. So based only on the location and the impounded, and this would be live volume and dam height, the hazard associated with the dam failure was underestimated, obviously. And this is why this triggered a lot of the changes in the regulation. So Dwayne, next slide. So, and here we go, right? So after this event occurred in 2010, we now very clearly know that the consequence should have been very high. And we're showing the loss of life potential that's actually consistent with high, but also it impacted the highway as well, that secondary road, and impacted, all the move of traffic and everything. It was shut right down. So we've got, although less than 29,000 cubic meters was released, we have a debris flow of 250,000 cubic meters was estimated. And you can see how devastating that was. And by sheer luck, this did not cause loss of life. But it, if you were to do the fatality rate on 250,000 cubic meters at the velocity it's coming, it would be 1.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just one home that was affected, it was multiple homes. I mean, when I say affected, I should say destroyed. So they were very fortunate that there was no loss of life in this event.
Right. So next slide, Dwayne. So
Yeah.
generally this case had many lessons. We're not going to go over all of them, but assessment of a dam break or dam break hazards or the consequences should consider the worst case scenarios, and should include flood-induced failures, should consider flood bulking, should consider landslides, and many other factors. Although they can be very simple, we need to be thinking about these things when we do our review. annual review and redetermination of consequence is important, right? We're going to have that consequence or hazard creep. It should have identified. So in this case, it should have identified the gradual construction of homes, vineyards, orchards, the growth of that highway, and so on. And this would have likely changed from low to some higher level that implemented, new risk reduction activities, right? That would be required. So mapping of the dam break hazard is also an important piece of information that should be used to support the preparation of dam safety management plan. So this dam at low wouldn't have one on file, and bumping it up, then if they're in compliance, they would have a dam emergency plan. Another thing that the new regulations in 2016, any dam on crown requires signs, and those signs require contact information to the dam emergency plan holder. We know that having that in place, and just by having the right consequence on file, would have mitigated the failure of this dam. There were people making phone calls about this dam prior to its failure. So, and it was a flood-induced failure. So it was over a little bit of water going over top of the road could be easily been mitigated. So there's a lot of different reasons why the consequence classification should be correct, because there's various ways that just having the consequence right would have mitigated this failure. So that's our last example of the day. So Dwayne, was there any other kind of takeaways that you'd like to mention?
No, I think we covered everything. We did mention that there are webinars online from previous training sessions that we've offered. And this particular webinar will eventually find its way there once we edit it up a little bit and shrink it down as much as we possibly can. And so dam owners are encouraged to find some time and watch these things if you're not familiar with some of these topics, and make sure that your consequence classification is done and it's done correctly is probably a nice takeaway message for today's webinar.
Okay, so we'd like to thank you, but before you leave, we have 2 links